1980 saw the Kangaroos eliminated in the first week of the finals, and for Barassi, that was it. His 200th and final game for the club. He completely turned around and given 2 premierships, 7 consecutive finals appearances, and icons both homegrown and poached. It only made sense that he was to be replaced by perhaps the second biggest name that North Melbourne had generated.
Hello again. Malcolm Blight stepped in and became, alongside Alex Jesaulenko, the last playing coach appointed in the VFL. Schimmer was appointed as playing skipper, and a host of new talents have been brought in to replace the mass departure of stars, including him. Hooray. Blight's coaching tenure, at least this one, would be brief. Unable to split attention between playing and coaching, a 129-point defeat of Melbourne would somehow spark a run of 6 straight losses, none of which were close, including a toweling at the hands of, ironically enough, Geelong. He handed the reins over to Barry Cable halfway through the year, with North spiralling towards the bottom. He and they recovered somewhat under Cable, Blight kicking 70 goals for an 8th place side. Cable brought stability to the coaching role, and our old friend Ron Joseph brought something rather special. Well, 2 somethings, actually.
Phil Krakouer was an Indigenous man from Mount Barker, WA. He started playing footy and he was amazing. His acceleration, his pinpoint passing, his elusiveness was such that Claremont picked him up as an 18-year-old. He went at over a goal a game, rotating through the midfield and forward flank, winning the 1981 flag before North came a-knocking for 1982. They offered him and his brother a combined $750,000 over 3 years. That, the guarantee of money with no performance conditions, and a WA legend in Cable running the show, sealed the deal for both of them. Phil got on fine, proving an amazing player. Jim, on the other hand, was a more complicated story. Jim got off to a troubled start. At 16, he and his cousin were accused of R-wording. They maintained their innocence, but as Indigenous teenagers in Australian court systems of the 1980s, it was advised they plead guilty. Just one example of racial prejudice that he, along with his brother, would have to face throughout their careers. In fact, Phil would go on to be the leading face of a class action lawsuit that's happening right now against racial prejudice in the AFL. Jim was sentenced to 2 years, serving 6 months, and despite missing a chunk of the season, he won his league's best and fairest at 17. He was crazy good, but would struggle to avoid legal trouble. The next year, with a fresh driver's license, he hit a man with his car, killing him. Cue another 18-month prison stay, albeit this time with day releases to play in his footy league, which was a real unpopular decision. Nonetheless, Claremont and then North wanted him too, along with Phil, and wherever they went, they made a big difference. It's like they were psychically linked, able to find each other with outrageous accuracy. The 500 goals they combined to score over their 7 years at North Shore helped as well, with the two becoming the only brothers to share a club-leading goal kicker award in 1983, with each brother winning solo awards from 1985 to 1988, each taking turns, which is just lovely. What isn't lovely was the year before Jim won his best and fairest in 1986. He decided to follow a WA hero's lead, his coach, in coming over to Melbourne. He continued following his lead by engaging with underage women, this time consensually, in a cocktail of allegations which also contained assault and perversion of justice. Jim was in trouble. He's a VFL footballer in Melbourne now. The Melbourne court decided to uphold a tradition of not punishing top-level footballers for their actions, giving only community service even after Jim had breached his bail conditions to add more charges to his register. Jim would say, right after it was over, that none of this would affect his career or legacy. Sure enough, it seemingly hasn't. He's in North's Hall of Fame, while his brother isn't. He was told to stay away from the girl, which he did, good job, with his wife even stepping in to intervene. Wait. He committed adultery with a minor, and he's one of very few VFL footballers with a body count, and he's in North's Hall of Fame ahead of his equally talented brother? Okay, fine, whatever. North, you do you. Look, I sure hope this doesn't shape North's players' relationships with and views of women going forward. Oh, as for Jim, he would develop a gambling addiction that he sunk his very large paycheck that he was lucky to be able to collect on, turning to drug dealing to get that money back. He would spend 9 years in jail after his footy career, and seemingly his immunity being a VFL player, ended. From now on, if ever I mention how good Jim was as a player, this doesn't disqualify all of this. Do not bow at the altar of Jim Krakouer. Bow at Phil's though, by all means. The Crackers, as well as the new addition of the man with the best name in football, Donald McDonald, oh the poor bastard, turned North around. Jim and Phil scored 50 goals combined. Phil Carman also came over from Collingwood, closing out a wild career with 27 goals, while Schimmelbusch had matured into an elite rover, nearly breaking 500 disposals while chipping in with 37 goals of his own. Glendinning, Hodgman and Greg were all doing great things, but it takes a true legend to stand above all of these men. And Malcolm Blight is a true legend. He'd spent most of his career as a rover / forward flank, but as his 30s rolled around, he moved into the forward line more permanently. Shorter than your typical full forward, he scored 70 goals in 1981, which was great, but not as good as 1978, where he'd kicked 67 and gathered 430 disposals. How did he only win that Brownlow by 1 vote? But that 1981 season has an asterisk. 1978's feats came in 24 matches. His 70 goals in 81 came in 15, at over 4.5 per game, including 11 against Footscray. With the Crackers added, and with Dempsey feeding them, Greg and Schimmelbusch also in the midfield as well, Blight was going to have service unlike any other year. He opens with 7 against a Richmond side that will make the grand final, 6 against Sydney, 2, a missed game, and 4 over the next 3 is less than ideal, but then 8 against the Hawks and 7 against the woeful Demons takes him to 4.85 per week, or 107 over a full season. He won't get a full season though, as he misses 2 games. His return against Footscray saw him kick 7 goals 7. He would miss 1 more game the rest of the way, but when he did play, he would only once dip below 3. It wasn't enough though. 94 goals was his tally. But of course, a squad with a 94 goal forward and a star-studded midfield made the finals. A hot start against Essendon nearly meant nothing as the Bombers would equalise late on. However, Shimmer, the skipper, did enough to earn the Kangas the win, Blight netting 4 to take his tally to 98. Then, despite another great start, the ruse fizzled out again, eliminated at the hands of the Hawks, allowing Derm to kick 5 on debut. Nice work. During that early impressive run, Kelvin Moore holds the arm of Blight. He's on 99 right now, and the siren has just sounded for quarter time. Blight's famously missed much easier chances than this, but for a man who kicked an after the siren goal from 52 metres out, this one's a sitter. And he nails it. And despite being a final, just like Dougie Wade, no one dares to hop over the MCG fence. This is the second and final time a North player will pass 100 goals. No crowd invasions resulted. For a club who has had to necessitate a full match replay because of a crowd invasion, this is kinda sad.
Blight would work his way to 103 and then never play for North again. He went back to Woodville, his original club, who was slowly dying their own death. His final season playing resulted in 126 goals, making him the only man to receive the league best and fairest and top goal kicker in the SANFL and VFL, having achieved all of his awards in different years. Amazing. No one will ever do that again. He played 178 games for North, kicking 444 goals, the longest lasting piece of Barassi and Joseph's premiership-winning recruiting drive. North do not win flags without this man. This will not be the last you hear of Malcolm Blight in this story, but it will be the last time that he is a North hero. Salute. Is that too cringe? I think that was too cringe.
So North's just lost a 100-goal forward. Ian Fairley was their biggest new name, and as far as big names go, he wasn't one of them. Not yet, anyway. The Crackers stepped up, sure, and the eternally underrated Hodgman had another great season, but one man pushed the Kangaroos further than anyone thought possible. Ross Glendinning topped 500 disposals for the first time in his career to give North Melbourne yet another Brownlow medal, again by a single vote. This, along with great work again from Schimmelbusch, gave North Melbourne the minor premiership. Yeah, out of nowhere they topped the ladder in round 12 and just never looked back. They looked a likely shot for the flag too. Let's take a look at their contenders. You had Hawthorn turning into a superpower thanks to their country zone and, of course, Alan Jeans, and then who else? Fitzroy, a side who bobbed up out of nowhere with a flag drought rivaling North in the 70s, an Essendon side under new coach Kevin Sheedy who are far too young to really do anything yet, and a 13-win Carlton whose best era seemed well behind them at this point. So who were North to face in the grand final then? Well, no one. Despite a goalless first term, those Hawks munched North, with Mick McCarthy of all people scoring 4. Then that two young baby Bombers side tore North completely to shreds, running out 86-point winners. Oh, and as for Fitzroy?
Y'all ready for this? Oh no, they were ready for that.
By this time, the league was beginning to professionalise, which meant facilities were being upgraded at record pace. The MCG was now a world-class stadium. VFL Park was undergoing discussions for an expansion to 140,000, making it the second biggest stadium in the world, and Sydney were playing out of the SCG, one of the finest test venues in the country. Smaller clubs with smaller stadiums and, more pressingly, smaller budgets were being left behind. The players signing arms race that North had led from the front in had resulted in silverware, yes, but it had come at a very literal cost. The club was unprofitable, and thus Arden Street couldn't be developed to match Princes Park or even Victoria Park. North, in 1984, had to make the tough choice, taking a better deal from the league and moving their home matches to the MCG. Average home attendances after moving to the 100,000 capacity venue from a stadium 5 times smaller, well, they dropped. North's embarrassing finals exit also took a toll mentally, with on-field results cratering. They finished 11th, only avoiding beating a bankrupt intermission year St Kilda outfit to the spoon on percentage. Gross. This marked an abrupt end to the Roos power years, and not just results-wise. Bridus, Carlton, Dempsey, Dench and Kerry Good all retired, all having played in many North finals, Dench having skippered a few and making his way to North's team of the century, alongside Barry Cable, who stepped down as coach after that awful campaign. Keith Gregg, having broken Dench's games record in 1983, would only have one more season in him. In addition, Harold Henderson, who'd founded the team's social club, also passed away that year. Even Doug Wade and John Dugdale, former players who'd found their way into coaching and backroom positions, stepped down. It was a complete clean-out. What North needed was a strong figure to lead their recovery, an established man with success like Barassi. Plus, the Hawks were successful now and had helped end North's last 3 finals runs. I wonder if there's a successful old Hawks coach lying around. Ah, there's one. Remember how Barassi was one of the great motivators, albeit one who at times was completely mental?
Ah, you stupid bloody lesbian!
Well, Kennedy was the refined version of that. His steady but firm leadership gave the Hawks their first success, and their second, and their third, and set them up to be coached to flags later on by David Parkin and now Alan Jeans. Ron Joseph, as he did, went on the journey to recruit him, an unachievable goal. Actually, no, that doesn't sound right. What's another way I can put it? Ah, thanks, Jared. A Don Gahowdy reference. How apt.
They didn't need to dream of giants anymore, though. These were monsters, not windmills, and a very real weapon was needed to take them down. For that, they needed some money. Luckily, their owner and chairman was a man named Ansett. Yeah, that's his dad's company. So, of course, he secured North a sponsorship deal. with Qantas. Yeah, Bob Ansett was a fascinating man. Needing a job in the 70s, he sought one with Avis, another company his dad Reginald owned, having had the brilliant idea of founding both an airline and a rental car business. Two birds, one stone. Bob asked for a job, Reg said no, so Bob said fuck it and made his own rental car business, Budget, going into direct competition with his own dad. Fun. He actually started quite well, surpassing Avis's market share thanks to just trying to give the customer the best price. What a novel prospect, I know. Of course, this is the rental car business, which values human customers about as much as a hungry shark would, so Bob went bankrupt in 1990 with $55 million of debt to his name. The Qantas deal he signed for the Roos, though, would give them valuable capital that would see them through as one of the very few clubs not to be embroiled in financial crises throughout the 1980s. Actually, I want to talk more about Bob. Oh god, it's the Bankruptcies Commission. Bob had taken over as chairman in 1980 and instantly brought his marketing acumen to the club. Budget had a policy where even its top brass had to serve at least one day per month as customer service reps. Famously, Bob himself lost Budget a fair deal of money by accidentally skipping the payment paperwork for a large crowd in Brisbane one day. And so Bob himself would actually roam the streets of North Melbourne selling North memberships. He would also arrange lavish and bizarre pre-game entertainment at Arden Street, skydivers, dancing girls, the lot, all to bring in more people in, and more importantly, bring them in early. The longer the patron spends at your ground, the more likely they will spend money. The problem with that, though, is that you've got to try and top this approach every time. You've got to try and keep inventing crazier things. Long story short, some guy from the zoo down the road turns up and says to marketing director of the Roos and former player Barry Cheatley, "Hey, you want this elephant? It'll behave, I promise." Faced with 20,000 fans though, it didn't. Oops. Luckily they managed to wrangle that thing and get it under control before it gored anyone, and now it's a story that Ansett can laugh about. Cheatley, unfortunately, passed away during the writing of this series. He was a pivotal leader of these marketing drives, and it's safe to say that without the interest he generated, North would be in a worse place right now. So, rest easy, Barry, and thanks for your contributions to this great club. Bob also pioneered in a more revolutionary way. The various night series and Escort Cup games have generated a lot of support for night football. Jack Hamilton, new VFL president and very much less of a progressive than Alan Aylett was, still staunchly refused to play football at anything other than the traditional 2:10 on Saturday afternoon time slot. Sydney had radicalised things somewhat, escaping Victorian governmental restrictions to play on Sundays in New South Wales, but more could be done. Ansett rammed it through Hamilton's thick traditionalist skull that night football on Saturdays and even Fridays could work. And so it was. North would open its 1985 season under lights against the Pies on a Friday night, but not without hiccups. The new residents occupying the very ground North had won its first premiership on, well, they didn't like their ritzy digs flooded with footy peasants at night, and the glare from the massive MCG light towers sure didn't help matters at all. So the VFL left only half the gates open, and Bob Ansett tells that even to half-time, there were masses of people still trying to get into the ground just to watch a North game. Crazy notion nowadays. 65,821 people got through the gates in the end to witness a game that never felt competitive after quarter time. Yeah, sure, the result was a bit of a wash, but commercially, ka-ching. The VFL saw the potential, and so North were given exclusive rights to host night games until Sydney hosted one in round 5, 1987, beginning the spread of the concept for interstate teams. The first VFL game for premiership points to not feature North Melbourne that was played at night wasn't until 1988. From there, Friday night football became an institution, and the footy landscape would be unimaginable without it. We have Bob Ansett and his board to thank for that. Bob also helped out in one large final way. Yes, the Qantas sponsorship was great, but the best thing he did was floating the company on the public stock exchange, one of very few clubs to ever do so. The shares raised $3 million, half of which paid off all of North's debts. The other half kept the club well stocked for the rest of the 1980s and even probably beyond that. Yes, a couple of months later the stock market crash that would doom the budget rent-a-car business came along and completely destroyed the price of the shares, but the club had made the money it needed to survive. Of course, big shout out again to the rest of the board at the time, and big shout out to that motorist over there who's performing an illegal turn, including John Adams, for reasons I'll delve into later, because that won't be the last we hear of these shares. A fantastic story is about to begin, a circumstance of the age of the merger that will threaten the very existence of North Melbourne as an entity not once, but twice. But before we get there, a quick tangent.
1985, 1986 and 1987, not great years for North, but nowhere near as bad as some of their rivals. Footscray and Fitzroy were on life support, Melbourne hadn't won so much as a raffle for decades, and Sydney were in ownership spill number 643. 1987 was the biggest of these years for many reasons. First, it marked the entry of these two clubs, giving all other clubs a nice financial windfall, not that North really needed it. The second was an influx on the board. Keith Gregg provided a familiar face, and Ron Casey would prove pivotal going forward. Third? Well, that was the influx of playing talent. Alistair Clarkson, Mark Hepburn, Jeff Chandler and Craig Scholl entered the fray to a lot of success. Fourth was the sudden retirement of Wayne Schimmelbusch. Yeah, he was still here, and still looking $1 million until a value bankruptcy thanks to a serious injury suffered at the hands of the Swans. That was his 306th and final game, which stood as a club record for ages. I'd call him the ultimate club man, but someone's coming soon who actually is, so suffice to say that Schimmer was both an eternal fixture of a well-led North side and also taken from that playing lineup too soon. Without their leader, North jutted to a fifth-placed finish and were trounced by a whopping 118 points by a Melbourne side that didn't even make the big dance. And now, for the final reason that 1987 was such a big year. The VFL had a special plan for 1987, the Foster's Cup. Having followed on from a smaller competition at the Oval in 1986 that North won, this was a series of international showcases in an interconnected tournament played across 3 continents. Very financially sensible for a cash-strapped league and a bunch of bankrupt teams. Anyway, North were due to play reigning premiers Carlton in London. This was supposed to be a fun little exhibition match to broadcast the game to the world. Instead, it turned so ugly and violent that it became known as the Battle of Britain and tarnished the legacy of the Foster's Cup, if it had one. The cup held no real value. The prize money for this game was $5,000, or 0.45% of the salary cap minimum. It would pay for 14.6 days of Phil Cracker's contract. You would think that a brand new trophy with no prestige and an amount of money that wouldn't even offset the plane tickets to get here wouldn't inspire such a brawl. What did was a certain man who becomes really important to our story for the next few years. Allow me to introduce you to John Elliott. I just want to ask you something as a viewer. What do you make of John Elliott? Was he a passionate and dedicated man who did all he could to help his club? Or was he a megalomaniacal motormouth who wanted complete control over everything he could find, no matter what, so he could plaster his name on it all in massive block capitals? Well, your opinion depends largely on when you were born and what club you support. Whatever the answer, one thing you could say for sure was that he would always speak his mind, for better or for worse. The night before this match, he decided it'd be a good idea to claim that if his team won, he'd put the $5,000 toward the bar to continue the premiership party. We're deserving winners after all, because surely if North won, well, they'd just try and pay their coaches massive wages. This riled said coach up, and this wasn't a bloke you wanted angry if you were the opposition. John Kennedy was the great motivator. We've already covered his impassioned words to Bob Keddy that turned the mediocre ruckman into prime Peter Hudson, and if you stuck around this long in the series, you remember the don't think, do speech.
Don't think, Mick! Don't hope, do!
So it should be no surprise that he stuck a firecracker up his side. Already a team with more to prove than their opponent, Kennedy threatened poor performers with the axe and wanted them to give 110%. No excuses, no stepping back. The Roos hit the field. 10 minutes later, Donald McDonald hits David Rhys-Jones. McDonald wasn't as goofy as his ridiculous name suggests. He was an enforcer, and Rhys-Jones was tough and a match for Donald. They'd gotten into trouble together before and had no hesitation renewing old acquaintances. Ian Aitken comes in to remonstrate, get some revenge, stick up for his teammate in Rhys-Jones, and, thanks to Alistair Clarkson, he doesn't remember much after that. A wicked coward hit breaks Ian's jaw. Players from both sides flood in to get their own back, with Clarkson being target number 1 for Carlton, broken up only when the stretcher had to come out to carry poor Ian from the ground. Aitken was one of the most promising youngsters in the league. This ended that. He played on, but never fulfilled that prophecy and retired early. Carlton coach Robert Walls was incensed. He pulled his charges together, pointed at the man who'd felled the kid considered to be the future of Carlton Football Club, and he said, "Boys, that prick doesn't leave here walking." He would, but only just. He was a target for the next 75 minutes, which just became a rolling brawl all around the ground. At one point, Walls saw Kennedy, who he deemed personally responsible for this savagery, and ditched a walkie-talkie with such force that if it came a few inches closer, might well have killed the North Melbourne coach. Only 7 players would be reported, and although North would win the game and later the tournament, they still haven't shaken loose the ugly mark that this game left. As we've touched on, the 70s revitalised North, turned them from an also-ran into a destination club, a perennial contender, and Bob Ansett's steady ownership would continue that into the 1980s. But all of this had come at a cost. Barassi, Blight, Cable, Wade, all of these guys had been expensive to procure in a league that was becoming more expensive by the minute to stay competitive in. North were far from the only club splashing cash to win no matter the cost, and, as we've established, that put the league at a real sliding doors moment. North, as I've mentioned, went into heavy debt, and 3 of the league's 12 clubs were bankrupt. Wait, sorry, I read that wrong. Only 3 of them weren't bankrupt. Merger ideas were being floated around everywhere, but none had taken, and by 1990, one man had an idea to make sure a merger would stick for good. John Elliott. His proposal to form a rebel football league in 1984 had failed. In a way, at least, his demands for reform were met, but he gained no power. He then turned his attention to creating a super team, going on the last great interstate recruitment wave to secure the 1986, no, 1992, no, 1993, no, 1995, yes, 1995 flag, finally got one. Before that had finished happening, though, he set about expanding the super team concept. He knew no team would merge without approval from its shareholders, i.e. its members, so he set his sights on becoming the shareholder of the only team without a member-based management structure. North had punched above their weight, but Elliott knew their budgets were low. Carlton were far richer than their neighbours, which meant the time was ripe for a nice, family-friendly, hostile takeover. So, in 1991, that's exactly what Carlton set about doing. Carlton did what no other team had done before or since in football or indeed any other sport in Australia. They bought shares of another team in their league. 20% to be exact, in an attempt to be the controlling shareholder. Unfortunately for Carlton, North had thought ahead. There had been a major board spill and reshuffle in 1990 thanks to Bob Ansett's bankruptcy. There were now 8 major shareholders, including Kerry Good and John Kennedy. That meant that common shares were harder to procure, Carlton having to scrape for discounts at Bob Ansett's bankruptcy clearance bargain house fire sale. Then, when Elliott announced that a takeover was inevitable, North delisted all the remaining shares in an attempt to prevent it, a move originally written into North's procedures allegedly by Bob Ansett himself, but with considerable input from John Adams according to Gerard Dowling, and it worked. Essentially, although Carlton were now a major stakeholder in a rival, they couldn't actually do anything about it. They'd wasted their money. Little did they know, though, that this purchase sowed the seeds that would lead to a 9-figure windfall for North. Admittedly, a 9-figure windfall that would threaten the very existence of North as a club, but we'll get there. Let's take it back to 1989. Sydney was struggling as the 1990s dawned. They changed hands more times than the biggest dick at a swingers party, and the players had suffered multiple instances of not getting paid. They needed cash, instantly and desperately, and were selling off great young talent at bargain prices. North had been missing a key forward presence since Blight had gone, and they asked about a 16-year-old that was lighting up the New South Wales OMFL competition. This was a kid who was born for football. His uncle, grandfather and great-grandfather had all played at the highest level, and he was already massive. The Swans, desperate for the pittance North were offering, said yes, take him. He kicked 4 on debut but didn't have much luck after that. North, though, were needing a key presence in defence, so this kid was switched to full back, where he had a stunning performance against the best forward of the era. But North still weren't doing much scoring, so he was sent back to the forward line at the end of 1989. His numbers weren't great. 9 goals, 11 from 4 games. In his opening game for 1990, he went goalless. The experiment wasn't looking like it would yield results. But then, holy shit. John Longmire became perhaps the youngest man in the AFL era to kick 10 goals or more in a game. Of course, facing early 1990s Richmond sure helped with that, but Longmire would score every week, even as North lost 6 in a row until facing Sydney, funnily enough. And then, once again, he responded to going goalless by breaking North's single-game scoring record. Melbourne were powerless to stop him. 14 goals too he kicked as North managed their highest ever score since, well, the last time their teenage full forward kicked a big bag. All of this was before he turned 20. By the time he blew out the candles on that 20th birthday cake, he had added the Coleman medal to his trophy cabinet with a 98-goal tally that should have been in the triple figures if not for a horrifically inaccurate showing in the final round. Longmire would score 90 the next season and helm a young and exciting forward line throughout the 1990s. And yeah, that was great, but it wasn't getting the club wins. Everyone, even Adelaide, who were 3 years old, had a 90-goal forward or similar. Wayne Schimmelbusch was the coach at the time, and he was still an absolute legend, but results were eluding him. He entered 1993 with a 31-35 record, but was determined to see out the season. He ended up being sacked before it even started, with a 147-point loss to Adelaide in the pre-season, spelling the end of his coaching career. In steps a 35-1 Smokey to get the job, whose middle name was Leslie. This ought to go well.